Talking now with Shirley Adkins. Shirley is, of course, a well-known member of the general aviation public in Western Australia. Shirley, you were employed at Maylands Aerodrome. When did you start there?
At the end of 1946, straight from business college. I got the offer of the job at the Royal Aero Club, so I went out there and got interviewed by Mr. Ken Smith, who was a very foreboding-looking ex-senior Air Force officer, and I was shivering in my boots. Anyway, I ended up getting the job, and that's where it all started.
Operations just after the war, I guess, were still on fairly much military lines because of the fact that so many people who were employed in aviation then had come out of the Air Force.
To a certain extent they were for a short time, like the buildings that we occupied at Maylands. The office that I had was actually in the clubhouse, which was an old Air Force bar building, and shortly after that, I suppose about 6 months or so after I started, we moved the offices over into the hangar, which was where they stayed till we moved from Maylands to Perth Airport.
And Reg, I understand, was an instructor at the Royal Aero Club at the time.
He's learned to fly in 1948 and became an instructor in 1950.
So would there be anything in him going to learn to fly in 1948 and discovering that you were there working at the time?
Well, I don't think so, because...
So it was love of aircraft and not of
me
that took him into
at that
flying?
time, yes. He has mentioned he did have another girlfriend when he first came to the Aero Club.
I see. And when did he realise the error of his ways?
I don't know really. I think that I tripped him up one day, and I think then he realised that it was handy to be friendly with this young lady in the office, because I used to be responsible for handing out all the flights to commercial charters for the Tigers, which you believe people used to ring up and want to go to Albany and places like that. And it would be up to me to allocate them to this great crowd of young, hopeful commercial pilots to be. And Reg was one of them, so whether that was what changed his mind, I'm not sure.
Well, now let's get away from Reg and get to you, as you're one of the most famous women pilots in Australian aviation history, and probably the most famous one in Western Australia. So when did you actually start to fly?
In 1950, I actually worked at the club for 3.5 years, and I used to see all these people obviously loving what they were doing, but I must admit I didn't have any inkling about learning to fly or becoming a pilot before that. And the lady who worked in the store in the hangar, she and I said to each other one day, how about we learn to fly? And she had been in the WAFs, and so she was quite a bit older than me. We saved up enough for 10 hours, which was £30 in those days, enough to go solo, and I went solo in 10 hours and 10 minutes. I think Bowie took a bit longer, but that's where it started. There had been, I suppose, 9 or 10 girls go through in the years from 1947 to about 1949, but when Bowie and I went through, there were only about three females learning to fly at that time.
Did you maintain your flying for a period of time after that, or was there a break when you started to have family?
We got married in 1952, and I kept my licence going until 1955, and that's when we started building a house and having a family and so on. So I let my licence lapse for about 15 years. In 1970, I still remained active in the Women Pilots Association, etc. And Reg wasn't very happy with me going flying with other pilots on fines and things, so I said, well, the alternative is I learn to get my licence back again. So he said, okay, and he thought I'd never do it, because when we learnt to fly in Maylands, you didn't have to do any theory at all, but of course it was different in 1970, so I went down to the Aero Club and did it all by sort of correspondence. Went down 1 week and got all the papers for one subject, went home and studied for 2 weeks, did the exam, went down the next week and got all the papers and got my theory subjects done. And then of course I was confronted with this Fuji aircraft, which was a bit like Reg going from a Tiger Moth to a DC-3, but it was going from an aeroplane that had no brakes, flaps, radio or anything, into this Fuji which had everything, flaps, brakes, radio, and the circuit at Jandakot Airport. And my first couple of circuits I thought, I'm never going to be able to fit all this into this circuit, radio calls and listening to understanding what the control tower was saying, because of course at Maylands there was no control tower, you just worked it out for yourself what you had to do. So really I suppose at Maylands it was harder really, because you had to use your own initiative a lot more in which way to land and which way to take off, and nobody told you.
You moved then into, as I recall, into competition flying, and you were very successful there over many years, becoming the West Australian Light Aircraft Champion on at least 3 occasions, I think.
Twice. Yes, I think you followed me the last time.
Oh, one-upmanship.
Yes, I must admit I used to get butterflies in my stomach when I first started, because there weren't any other girls flying competitions at that time. That was the early 70s. And I used to get some fairly rude comments from some of the fellows, you know, when I'd happened to bounce or something, mainly because I was so nervous. But then I really got to enjoy it and did aerobatics, formation flying, everything there was to do.
And you moved right along then to becoming a committee member of the Royal Aero Club?
Yes.
And subsequently, of course, you became the first woman president of the Royal Aero Club. Had there been women on the committee before that?
No.
So you, in fact, had a Quinella there, first woman on the committee, first president. How long did you remain in that role?
5 years, and then I became vice president and then president of the Royal Federation of Aero Clubs of Australia.
So this meant you flying off to the eastern states all the
Quite
time?
often, yeah, for about 7 years.
Did you, you didn't take your own aircraft at that stage? No, you travelled in comfort.
Too long, yep.
But you did have, as I recall, a Tiger Moth. Was that the first aircraft that the Adkins family had?
That's the first one we owned, yes. We bought that after Reg retired, and we had that for, 10 years, I think it was.
So this was a second childhood thing for him?
Oh, yes, yes.
How far did you travel while you had the Tiger Moth? What sort of trips did you do?
Oh, we used to, in those days there used to be a lot of fly-ins to country centres and annual air races and air trials. We used to enter all of those. And of course there used to be lots of arguments between the front and the back seat. Reg used to always fly in the front seat because he, was still harking back to his instructor days. And I always used to be mainly the navigator flying in the back seat, and there was quite a bit of shouting and raving used to go on at times. In fact, one day we were taxiing out to set off in an air race, and one of the fellows at the club handed me this fly swat. And I said, "What's that for?" And he said, "Well," he said, "you're always complaining that you can never reach Reg's head to give him a belt over the head, so I've given you this."
This is assuming he was awake, of course.
Yes, that's right.
The communications in the aircraft had changed between the time that you learnt to fly the Tiger Moth and yours, I presume.
Oh yes, radio, yes.
Perhaps you can tell us how you could communicate in the early days when you didn't have radio with the person in the front seat.
It was with the Gosport, the original communication system, which was back from Sir Norman Peary's day. There was a system of tubes connected to headset and earpieces from one cockpit to the other. So your voice actually travelled along the tube. And I happened to have a Dutch flying instructor, so apart from the difficulty of hearing anyway, I had to interpret his language, which wasn't all that good. And
so then you went to, in the Tiger Moth you subsequently bought, it was radio, and then you had to interpret Reg's language, which is often not good either. Things didn't change, only the accent. And you don't own the Tiger Moth anymore, I think. Where did it go? What happened to it?
The Royal Aero Club bought it. We had it for 10 years, and we were starting to get very cold and sort of got to the stage in life where, when we used to go on the long trips, and we got to the stage in life where we thought it was time to have a bit of comfort when we went flying. And we were down in a hangar at Jandakot one day, and we saw this beautiful little Cessna 140, another tower dragger, little two-seater tower dragger. So we sort of had a walk around and had a look at that, and went home and had a think about it, and went back and said to the owner, could we take it would you take us for a fly? We'd like to go, And he said, "Oh, you two can take it if you like." Mm-hmm. So we hopped in it and off we went, and we went zigzagging down the runway. in this. We thought it was going to be like a tiger moth to fly, being a tail dragger, but it was quite different. And we ended up buying that and selling the tiger moth, and we've still got that. And that's what we're flying in the cavalcade.
So in the cavalcade of flight, we will be looking for this Adkins Cessna 140.
Yep.
And would be remiss of me to say at this stage, Shirley, that you were honoured after you became the President of the Royal Federation of Aero Clubs for your services to aviation by the award of the Medal of Australia, Order of Australia.
Yep, that's right.
And so I'm not sure how many others out in the cavalcade will be similarly endowed, but perhaps people can salute as you go past.
Thanks, Mal.
Thanks, Shirley.
Thanks.
This is the Centenary Cavalcade of Flight, and Malcolm Yeo was talking with Shirley Adkins.